Welcome, Sophie. Thank you for being on our show.
Thank you for having me.
To start, we would love to hear like a 60 or 90 second origin story and about what you're up to at the moment.
Okay, so at the moment I'm working on the Rethink Fish campaign at Compassion in Wild Farming. Before I worked at Compassion, I've always cared about the environment and animal welfare from quite a young age, and it kind of originated from a documentary I watched with Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall when I was about 16, and he went on to a broiler farm. So that's chicken farms that we raise for meat.
I saw that.
You saw it?
Yeah, it's so good.
It's really good, isn't it? Like, he's great,
Yeah.
and I had no idea what farming looked like. I just had that idea in my head that it was lots of animals out in pasture on the grass having a decent life. I didn't realize that chickens lived for barely over a month, if that. And the numbers were so vast. So from that moment on, I cared about the issue of animal welfare in food, and I tried to sort of shop free range and think about where what I'm buying comes from. And I then did a master's in Barcelona relating to animal law and policy, and I also did an internship at Mercy for Animals in the States. And while I was there, I was working on a project about the oceans and the ways that farming fish impacts the oceans, but also how we're catching wild fish and the damage it's doing. Mm-hmm. And I think from that moment, I kind of realized that fish are probably the most misunderstood animals, especially in the farming world. And the largest number of them and with the least protection. So that was something that I really cared about. And eventually I ended up at Compassion doing this role.
I think it was actually Chicken Run that I saw. That,
really?
Do you remember Wallace and, no, not Wallace and, who made...
it was by the same makers, I think. But I felt really bad because I saw it at the age of 7. I just didn't care. I think that day my mum gave us chicken pie for dinner and it just didn't But
it was probably one of the first times that you saw factory animals on television, and especially in a kids movie, it kind of opened your eyes a bit to oh my god, I didn't actually think about that, because you're so disconnected from what's on your plate. I think that's what you were just saying about connection to fish. That's one of the biggest problems with our society and our culture, is that we're so disconnected, and especially to fish, because most of us aren't even in the water ever.
Absolutely.
So you don't see fish. I loved it on the Rethink Fish campaign website. You talk about the emotional lives of fish. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about the emotional lives of fish?
Yeah, absolutely. Because fish are so misunderstood. I think when people think about animals, they're always surprised to hear how complex most animals are, such as monkeys or even pigs and chickens. But they kind of dismiss fish as not even probably being able to feel pain or be emotional. But the reality is fish are extremely complex. They've grown up in the same... they've evolved in the same world that we have. So they've developed a lot of really complex capacities that they need to be able to survive in the wild. One of those is to be able to suffer and feel pain so they can avoid predators and harm, which is essential for survival in the wild, but it makes living on farms really, really horrible. And we can talk more about fish farming a bit later. And but on a more positive note, there's loads of research and evidence that's been coming out over the last few years about amazing capacities fish have. So an example is that they're self-aware. There's a tiny fish called a cleaner wrasse. That's one of the only animals, including chimpanzees, dolphins, and elephants, that have passed a test, which is if you put a dot on their forehead or just on their body, and then they look in a mirror, they can recognize that is them, and they have a dot on their head. So it's something that very complex mammals have passed, and some birds, and a tiny fish has. So it just shows that we really do need to rethink fish, that we see them as these really basic creatures when they're very complex and self-aware.
I used to teach scuba diving, and so you'd have to learn all these cool facts to show people who were in your group. Be and then one of the animals that I most love when it comes to symbiotic relationships underwater was the shrimp and the goby, because they would have all these little things the goby fish would capture the food, or the shrimp would get the bits of food that were left over from the goby, but the shrimp would clean the house of the goby. Anyway, I can't remember exactly if that was how it worked, but there was all these kind of amazing symbiotic relationships when you get to see and understand the complexity of ocean ecosystems, and how crazy it is when we hit the balance so badly through our like unsustainable
Yeah.
fishing practices.
And that's so rare in the wild for two different species to actually collaborate and work together for survival. And there's another example of the grouper fish and an eel, or now they've found with octopus as well, that they work together when hunting. And so the grouper fish will be chasing a fish and the fish goes into the coral reef, and then it sort of points at the fish with its body, and if there's an eel nearby, and then the eel chases it out of the coral, and it kind of works together. And that's like, you have to be incredibly emotionally complex to be able to communicate with others from a different species and work together. Yeah,
there's that book someone published recently about octopuses. Did you read
I haven't
that?
read it, no.
Oh wow, no, it's so good. They
are
What's
complex.
what's the context in which Rethink Fish came about? Like, what's it trying to achieve?
I think, most people, when they think about farmed animals and the animal welfare and environmental impacts of farming, they think about the 60 billion land animals that are farmed. So that includes chickens, pigs, cows, and other animals. But in reality, there's another 1 to 3 trillion animals that are killed for food, and these are fish. And they are just the forgotten farm animal. They are often farmed in vast underwater hidden factory farms, and where you put in huge numbers, tens of thousands of fish into these cages. And we essentially want to target or campaign to members of the public, politicians, and businesses to rethink fish and realize that they are also complex animals that deserve a life worth living and a humane death.
I read that scientists are predicting that by 2048, so in hardly any time at all, the oceans are going to be a desert, no fish. Is that true?
Well, that's what the predictions are, which is terrifying, because the oceans are such a fundamental ecosystem that helps the other animals, land mammals, and everyone else survive. It's almost like the bees becoming extinct. You get rid of one essential part of an ecosystem, and it's really going to cause a huge amount of destruction for the rest of the world.
And is that mostly through overfishing?
I think overfishing has a huge part to play in that. Yeah.
It's scary because you see in the supermarkets, just in my lifetime, the amount, there's so much more fish for sale everywhere you go. So many different sushi restaurants and sushi bars, and almost on every block. And it's not just sushi, it's all in the supermarkets as well. And
every menu has salmon as the healthy option.
Yeah, and it's not surprising that now seeing this mass overexploitation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the moment, people are becoming much more aware of environmental impact of farming and animal welfare issues attached to intensive factory farms. But at the moment, people think, well, okay, I'll eat less land animals and more fish. And we're trying to help people realize that that's really not the way to go. If you care about animals or the environment, eating more fish is not a sustainable or humane solution.
So if I go somewhere, say to a restaurant, and there's many different types of fish on the menu, how would the fish have got there? Because I know there's different types of farming and fishing. You see it on the tuna cans, this is pole and line caught, and you imagine a little man with a pole and line and a fishing boat, and I'm sure it's not quite like that. So, and the other one is trawling, dredging.
So these are types of wild. So yeah, you either catch fish from the wild or you farm them. And so with the different types of catching fish from the wild, as you said, one is line caught. And the image that springs to mind is people sitting at the end of a pier with a line, and they just catch fish, throw them in a bucket. But in reality, it's much more intensive than that. So these lines will be kilometers long, with loads and loads of different hooks on them. And it doesn't discriminate between different animals, so it will catch the fish they're intending to catch, but also other bycatch such as turtles and other animals. And if, these animals do feel pain and suffer, so it's painful for them to be attached to the hook, but they're also dragged for a day or more. It's a really long time they'll be on there, and that's an extremely terrifying and painful process for them.
So dolphins and turtles, they just get killed, or
they will die if they eat the bait. That will kill them. And trawling is not much better. In fact, it's pretty horrific as well. So these fishing boats, again, you probably imagine quite small fishing boats with people with nets, and they pull fish onto the boats. But in this intensive scale where we're catching billions and billions of fish, these boats are huge, immense sort of monstrosities with really large nets that drag on the ocean floor behind them. And when they drag on the floor, they're destroying coral reefs and natural habitats that a lot of animals use and need for survival where they live. And these nets will be catching tens to hundreds of thousands of creatures. Again, it does not discriminate. They catch anything in their path. And all of these animals will be pushed on top of each other. A lot die just from the pressure of getting pulled out from the bottom of the ocean to really quickly to the top. And it's just really like a scary and painful process to go through.
I've seen some recordings of these nets like coming out of the water and then opening, and you just see like so many different types of species, like sharks and dolphins, and everything's in the mix. Like it's just crazy.
But would that boat be looking for a particular kind of fish, like trout or I don't know, sea bass or something, or is it then, or are people then going through the bycatch and kind of sorting it out as well?
Usually they'll have sort of quotas for different types of fish they'd want to catch. Okay. And bycatch is a bit complicated. I think traditionally they're more likely to just throw it off the boat, and now especially in the EU there is a bit more regulation around having to bring bycatch back to shore to be able to measure how much there is, but the bycatch still isn't used and is discarded. So a lot of those are animals that they didn't intend to catch.
But Hugh Fearnley-Whitting still has campaigns against quotas, doesn't he?
I don't know too much about that.
I think there were quotas imposed.
Is this the fish fight?
I don't know, something else. But I know there are people campaigning against quotas because it ends up people catching loads of fish, they've caught too much fish, and then they dump the excess so they don't get fined.
Yeah, and it's just a really imperfect system. Even though you can limit what we're catching, it clearly isn't working. As you said, if we keep going at the rate we are, the oceans will be virtual deserts.
And a lot of that fish goes to us to eat, but it also goes to other places, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of these fish farms, so a typical fish farm is a net off the coast of the sea, and those nets are they're called cages, and as I said, they house tens of thousands of fish, so they're really in cramped conditions and they're really dirty, murky areas. But a lot of the fish that we farm eat other fish. So for example, salmon that we raise in Scotland, the Scottish salmon is in the wild, they'd eat other fish. So we need to fish a lot of fish from the wild to be able to feed these to the salmon. And so 1 in 5 fish caught globally from the wild is then fed to fish and for food. And this is just a huge waste because a lot of that fish could be used to feed humans, for example. And so with one full-size salmon, you need to feed it 350 fish caught from the wild. So it's just a really wasteful way of producing food.
Wow, because then the fish that then is being fed to the salmon has also, like through the bycatch, been then like kind of killed so many other fish already.
Absolutely.
Yeah. They're horrible, those farms, though, like antibiotics and...
Yeah, because there's so many fish packed together in such a small space, there's a huge amount of disease and parasites. So they'll be using a lot of farmers will need to use chemicals such as formaldehyde and hydrogen peroxide and insecticides. And these cages...
What's formaldehyde? Is that...
Formaldehyde is just a strong chemical, but a lot of these chemicals go straight into the ocean because they're in these cages, and so a lot of the life around these cages is non-existent. It's very difficult for animals in their natural habitat to survive, and there's lots of these farms around, for example, the Scottish coast or in Greece, and it's a lot of sufferings involved for the fish, but it's also damaging for the local ecosystems.
Yeah, and it's ironic because I know where they put them in Scotland, it's some of the most like ecologically diverse and like places of like most natural beauty within the UK, and then they just like turn them into deserts all around there.
What's the point of the fish farms? Why were they started? Is it meant to be a kind of solution to something to the bycatch?
I think partly a solution, but also it's more intensive farming, so we can produce more. And I think because the demand for salmon, trout, sea bass, sea bream is growing, we want to figure out, people have wanted to figure out ways that we can feed more people and reach that demand. And farming was quite an obvious way to go, in the same way that we started farming other animals like pigs. We would have once maybe hunted for wild boar and then eventually realized we could farm these in one place, and it's a lot more cost effective, so less money is needed to raise more animals, but it still causes a huge amount of suffering, huge amount of mortalities. And another example with the salmon, these are migratory species, so they travel really far throughout their lifetimes. And a salmon, for example, it might go 1,000 miles to Iceland, and then using the Earth's magnetic what's it called? Like the magnetic fields, it as a compass, it can figure out where it's born and go back there.
Wow.
But in a sea cage, they're just swimming in circles for at least 18 months. They live a long time as well, so they're just swimming in circles in very barren, cramped environments, and it's really not a life worth living.
No, it's amazing that like the way that language is employed within like hospitality and restaurants and supermarkets to kind of market certain foods to seem better than other kinds of food. So often I've heard people be like, oh, it's fine, I can eat this salmon because it's farm salmon, it's not from the wild, not knowing that salmon's had to have food that's from the wild and that of like those terrible conditions.
But salmon is always pitched like sustainable.
I think it's just a huge disconnect with people and their food on their plates. I definitely had no idea how extensive some of these issues were until I started working in fish farming and welfare and the environmental impacts of it. Before that, I wasn't very clued up about it. It's very difficult for an individual that goes to Waitrose or, Tesco's and wants to buy sustainable or humane fish. It's almost impossible to pick what is humane.
Is there such thing as sustainable fish?
There are certification schemes out there, such as the MSC and ASC, that intend to regulate sort of catch and make it more sustainable, but they are imperfect. And from a welfare perspective, they're totally inadequate. They allow a lot of horrific practices to continue under them that we wouldn't. Yeah, like if you are going to buy fish, you should definitely look out for these schemes. But our messaging is that really we should be eating less fish until we can solve some of these huge issues.
Yeah,
and eating smaller fish as well.
Absolutely, eating smaller fish. And
why?
Like lower down the food chain.
Lower down the food chain. Yeah, I guess so.
Or not really.
Just thinking what our view is on that. I guess it's good to diversify the kind of fish you eat. For example, there are fish that we farm that don't eat other fish because they eat plants. And an example, some of these are carp and tilapia. The issue is a lot of people wouldn't know where to go to buy carp. So one of the ways we could try to eat more sustainable fish is to encourage those types of farms and for the members of the public to diversify the kinds of fish they eat rather than sticking to salmon and tuna.
Can you go back a little bit to the certification bodies like MSC and what was the other one?
ASC.
So what are the practices that they're continuing that you feel shouldn't be allowed to be certified as sustainable?
They don't always tackle the issue with feeding fish to sort of fish that are farmed. Also, I've just read sort of bits in the news where MSC certifies fish that are from more vulnerable species. So I think it's just the case that until it's not as heavily regulated. To be honest, I'm not an expert in this that kind of the environmental side of it, but I've read a lot of where it's just inadequate at the moment, and they're not truly sustainable and they're not perfect. So although it's a step in the right direction, we're still heading towards oceans that are, you know, devoid of fish.
And what about shellfish?
Yes, shellfish. We at the moment, I don't actually know our stance on shellfish.
Yeah, because I've always imagined that shellfish wouldn't be as bad to eat for some reason.
No, I think there's like prawn farms in Thailand that are horrific.
Yeah.
And all over the world, not just there, I don't know why.
Yeah, I've heard about shrimp farming, that there's also like modern day slavery involved in some of the boats. People will go to work on them and then they will stay out in sea for months and months and they're not paid properly. And yeah, there's all sorts of other human issues related to these. But I think in terms of sea, growing more seaweed, that's amazing for the environment and great for human health. So we really think that is an area of farming that should grow dramatically.
It's difficult though as well, because a lot of like local, like small coastal communities, their cultural identity is really tied to fishing, and they'll go on their small boats, and so like I would personally be in support of like of that, and it is a way for people to live in harmony in a way with their ecosystems and to also like manage land, but then it's like how we live here in Europe and in these affluent privileged countries where we just pick from a menu without any like awareness of where things are coming from. Suddenly it's so much more complex, and how we live is they're making like these communities not be able to live how they were always living. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's these really intensive factory farms and intensive fishing practices that are damaging those smaller coastal communities and those smaller fishing vessels, because they'll be catching huge numbers of fish, so that others that catch just a small amount won't be able to do that in the same way, and that's damaging for local trade and for people that rely on that for food.
Yeah, there's a saying, I think, in lots of indigenous cultures that it's like thinking forward to next 7 generations, and like the decisions we and our actions that we do today, like the impact that they will have. I think that's quite beautiful.
Yeah, but it feels like to be able to live in that way is under so much conflict when we also live in a world of like convenience and consumerism and growth, and it becomes in such stark contrast to that ideal of living with thinking of the next 7 generations ahead of us.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's why we should make it as easy as possible for people to know what they're buying, to make decisions and choices based on what I think most people, that if they knew what was going on with the fish farms or the wild fishing, would be completely shocked by it. And we should make it clear that these are the practices that are happening, and are you okay with that? And perhaps they wouldn't choose to be buying these fish, and instead we should give them alternatives, which, you know, there are growing alternatives out there, especially in the sort of plant-based food world, that gives them other options for the time being that improves the lives of those animals and the environment.
I heard of a term yesterday that I'd never heard before called kilitarianism.
I've never heard of that.
Which is basically, if you would kill the animal, then you would eat the animal. So, for example, like, you know, if you know where like the animal that you're eating has come from, and you agree with the way that it was killed, you can kind of feel like there's a more like ethical validity to you eating that animal. But I just know that like the majority, because like a lot of the time I get frustrated walking past butchers with friends and them kind of like being squeamish at like the meat in the windows when I know they eat meat regularly. And I just think, if you're going to eat, not that I have an issue with them eating meat, that's their decision, but I have an issue with them not being able to be okay with seeing
it's like disconnect,
seeing the meat. I'm like, how can you not appreciate that is what you're later going to be eating? Especially
when they probably feel quite comfortable going to Tesco's and buying a chicken breast from there. But yeah, I agree, and I do think at Compassion, although it's a bit tricky with when people do have more of a connection to the animals they are eating. We also do advocate humane slaughters. We do think those animals should die in the most quick and painless way. So, for example, with people that kill their own animals, I don't know, it's tricky if the animal's not killed in a really humane way.
Yeah. What helps me though, because I'm not I am a vegetarian, but I still want to eat fish and meat often. So what helps me to just kind of get their thought out my head, because for me personally, I just don't want to be doing it because I now know too much, but it's to kind of visualize the way that animal has had to live in order to get to my plate, and that usually will just put me off completely.
Yeah. And the more you learn, the more you know how these animals are raised, the more shocked you are. I find the more I learn about all of these topics, and especially fish farming and wild caught fish, I am shocked by the numbers, the scale of it, the lives that the animals lead.
And a lot of fish is fed to animals as well, isn't it?
Yeah. So in the same way that fish is fed to other fish, so they're ground down into this into fish meal, which is then also fed to other farm animals. So in the same way, if you feed soy and grains to animals that could be fed to humans, it is quite a lot of waste. So that, because some of the energy used when feeding it to animals and then to humans is lost along the way. If that makes sense. And then, sorry.
No, continue. No, it does. Just took me a while to get the penny drop.
Yeah, I wonder if I should explain that better. But
so maybe explain it again. Yeah.
So in the same way that when we feed farmed land animals, grain and soy that we grow in areas such as Brazil, where they're chopping down rainforests for higher soy production.
Yeah.
A lot of the soy that is grown to be fed to animals could instead be fed to humans, and a huge amount of energy is lost in that process rather than just feeding it directly to humans. And a lot of fish that could be fed to humans are fed to other farmed animals such as chickens and pigs. And the amount of fish fed to chickens and pigs is twice the amount of fish that Japan eats a year, which is just staggering.
That is crazy. That's crazy. And I always think of Japan as the highest fish consuming country because of sushi.
I think,
and
wow. Why are they feeding fish to animals?
I think, a lot of this fish is just, they make a huge amount of fish meal and it needs to be fed to, it needs protein. To be used. It's cheap. Yeah. Essentially, it's just cheap.
I've been hearing lots about mercury in fish. Do you know much about that? And about the actual, because apparently it's now not even that healthy to eat fish because of the high quantity of mercury.
Yeah, I have a sort of a limited knowledge in that area, but from what we know, that, for example, tuna is quite a large fish that eats a lot of smaller fish. And because smaller fish have quite high mercury levels, when they get eaten by larger and larger fish, that those levels build up in the fish. So, for example, tuna is very high in mercury, and that can be damaging for human health. So there are, I think, smaller fish, less of an issue, but with the large ones, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder what the most convincing argument is if you're trying to change behavior. Is it recreating emotional connection to fish or the ocean in general, or is it the health side, or is it the welfare, shocking people with horrible facts on factory farms? And
I think people are so individual. So many people have different ways of connecting to these issues, and I think it's the same with farmed land animals. Some it's purely health, and they hear that beef and other meat products potentially aren't good for their health or could cause cancers, for example, and would avoid eating them as much. But other people, it's just the environment, for example. So I think it's good to help people to understand all of the different areas that it can be an issue. But we think that whether or not you care or are interested in the welfare of the animal, that is essential, because that is the animal that is being grown for food, and is the government's and political institutions' duty to make sure that they do live good lives.
Yeah.
What really sustains my non-eating fish stance is like remembering how delicate like the balance of the ecosystems are, and just that terrifying fact of, you know, our fish being so overexploited that it might even be almost a desert in the oceans by 2048, and without having the fish in the oceans, like, and that ecosystem collapsing, we'd collapse as well, because, and I think we often think of the ocean as so otherworldly that it's hard to create that emotional link, because you can do it a bit easier with farmed animals. They seem to relate more to humans than a fish. Not for you though.
Yeah,
you are a fish.
I think getting in the water is definitely a big step. Getting in the water with, you know what's amazing are these full head goggle systems. I mean, they're so sustainable. They're like huge plastic contraptions. But when I'm on the beach and you see people wearing them, like, for many people it's like the first time to see underwater in that really clear way, because you get that 360 view. I think that's really cool. Like even in the UK, where the water is freezing and it looks dark and dingy, we've got amazing wildlife here, especially in the seaweed. We've got seals. Like, it's incredible.
Dolphins as well.
Dolphins, whales, sharks.
And I also think that a lot of people think, what can one person do? And how do my individual actions make a difference if I buy salmon here and there? But if we have thousands of people or even millions of them making those decisions, it has so much power, and each person can do so much in their what they buy, and also writing to their ministers or supporting organizations like Compassion in some of the campaign actions we do. Slowly things will change, but we do need the public behind that.
And what about going to farmers markets and meeting fishermen and buying direct from them?
Oh, that's my eco-resolution. With just going to farmers markets more, I think is a great way to make sure you're buying local and organic. I'm not sure about fish, though.
I'm not sure about fish. No.
Yeah, is it? I mean,
maybe.
Is organic fish a thing?
There is Soil Association and RSPCA assured. Again, although they are improvements, so with the RSPCA, they are one of the only bodies that are helping to improve, for example, salmon welfare levels. So they make sure that the salmon's been stunned before slaughter. However, the lives of the salmon is still incredibly problematic, so we still don't support the purchasing of any salmon products from Scotland.
I've seen the pictures of the inside of these RSPCA assured cages, and they are horrific.
One of the big issues is the sea lice, which some of the horrific pictures you've seen are they burrow themselves into the heads of the salmon, and they slowly peel back their skin and leave exposed wounds.
Who do this?
Oh, the sea lice. They're these little parasites that burrow themselves into salmon, and they're a huge issue in Scotland at the moment. And they're just prevalent in every farm.
Because they're so compacted. So it's like a breeding ground for sea lice, and then that's why they put the antibiotics on.
And a lot of these sea lice will also infect other wild salmon or wild fish that come nearby. So it becomes sort of, as you said, a breeding ground for parasites. And these fish will live with these sea lice for many months. And there's a tool called a thermolyser, which they try to use to remove the lice from the salmon, but it's a really traumatic process for the fish. They gather them up and they shoot them through this machinery. So they get taken out of water, which for a fish is already terrifying. And they submerge them in quite warm water, so about 34 degrees, which is a lot warmer than what a salmon's used to. And
34 degrees?
Yeah, it's significantly warmer. They're used to cold sort of Scottish water. And so they keep them there for 30 seconds where the lice come out, and then they put them back into the cold water they're in. And this process causes huge numbers of mortalities from stress and pain for the fish.
I've seen pictures of farm salmon next to wild salmon, and the difference is crazy. Like, they just look like fat, sad. Like, they're just another species entirely.
It is so far removed from their natural wild state.
And when you see the colour as well of the meat once it's been prepared, this farm salmon meat is so like fluorescent because it's been fed all these dyed things in comparison to wild.
It's horrible. Are there more fish farms that are going to be built? What's like government policy on this?
Well, it's one of their most profitable industries in Scotland at the moment, so they have plans to grow it rapidly, and that's one. There are organisations such as One Kind that are doing incredible work to try to slow the growth or stop the growth of the industry until we can solve these huge welfare issues and environmental ones. Because,
I mean, people, like a lot of communities need to eat fish, and they have for decades relied on fish. But for me, it's it's like the unnecessary amount of fish that we seem to be eating. Like when you walk down the high street in London, for example, and it's just so much fish everywhere, and you just think this should be a luxury for us. There are so many other things that we can be eating right now. Why is fish seeming like something you can eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
Well, my dad grew up in Leicester in, the 60s, and he said it's the same with other types of meat. So they would have, he was one of 8 children, and they would have a roast chicken either once a week or less frequently. And it was like really appreciated. They were very grateful for that. And now we seem to think of these animals as a staple, like a necessity to each meal we have. And that's not how it used to be anywhere in the world. Yeah. Meat's been eaten for centuries, but as it was something you were very grateful to have, and you had it very infrequently. And now we have it so frequently, and it's the same with fish. We used to have, fish not that often, and now we're having it all the time. Yeah. And the issue is a lot of people that care about the environment are eating less beef, but then typically eating more fish to compensate, but that's just not a solution.
No. Our mum actually also grew up in the north of England and grew up in Salford with 7 brothers and sisters.
Oh, really?
She always tells me the same story about
the one chicken they were allowed to eat a week that made it last all week long. Yeah. Like, how did one chicken last you all week long with 7 of you?
Yeah. Yeah, and I've heard in like rural China, people used to have small pieces of meat that they'd chop up into smaller pieces, and that would feed about 20 people. And so you'd have meat in your meal, but small amounts. And we just get used to eating a huge steak every dinner. Yeah.
I think that's an important thing for us to remember, is that we often feel that the challenges we face globally from an environmental perspective, we often feel they're so established and like nothing can ever change. But actually, the way in which we consume and produce is a new phenomenon that's only been rapidly increasing really over the past 30 years, I guess. And so if it's, but like growing up within it, it feels like this is the way it always will have to be. And actually, we just need to become more aware ourselves, kind of become more committed and established in what we believe in, and then hopefully lead by example and keep like sharing this important information that you and Compassion are sharing. Because once you can't unlearn that. But it is very easy to just disconnect and kind of forget about it. So I think, reminding yourself and friends and family.
Yeah, and a fact that I learned recently is that 99% of hammerhead sharks have like vanished from the wild since the 70s, and that's only 50 years ago. I always think 30, but 50 years.
I swear, like hammerhead's one of the oldest species on the planet.
But it just shows how like recent a lot of these developments are, and how rapidly they're causing problems for the wildlife and the oceans.
Yeah. And that reflects, we were speaking with Soil Association on the last podcast, and talking about the rapid decline in bee population as well, which, I mean, I think in Germany, the insect decline has been by 75% in the past 25 years, which, I mean, just thinking, from like the fish in the sea to like the insects in the air, I mean, this is such an interconnected crisis that we're facing. And so whatever we can do on every level is so important.
Yeah, apparently one economist who I really like called Jason Hickel, he said that the decrease in insect numbers is in direct inverse proportion to the increase in GDP. So the exact slant of GDP, of gross domestic, of like economic growth, is the same rate that insects have declined.
That's so interesting. I just feel like every aspect of the economy and politics, human health is so intertwined, and you can't just pick and choose what's interesting. I think they all are interlinked, and the more compassion we show for animals, humans, and the environment will also help in so many different ways.
Yeah, and as much as possible bypassing these huge corporations that can't help but just create vast amounts of waste and destruction in their wake.
Yeah. I really like how, I guess obviously it's compassion and wild farming, and that word compassion is such a fundamental value of EcoResolution, and a huge reason why we started as well, because there's a massive lack in the way that we in the compassion that we have for ourselves and for each other and for the natural world. And I think that the crisis that we're currently facing is such a reflection of that lack of compassion. But at the same time, there's also lack of compassion in the conversations that we're having around environmentalism, and so much finger pointing, so much blaming, and a lot of energy kind of going in the wrong directions and towards the wrong sources. I think on an individual level, rather than kind of blaming each other for things, often there's a lack of awareness or like a need for it to be a certain way. But we need to have more compassion in this area and kind of look to where the power really lies, and start to address that.
Yeah,
definitely.
We'll be empowered as individuals.
Yeah, and talking to people that don't always share your views or knowledge about these issues. I have a relative in the States who had a bit of an issue with animal activists and environmental activists and didn't really understand why they were trying to sort of force their opinions on them. And I just had a really long chat with him about all of the, just about his concerns, but actually why we do what we do. And by the end, he was like, thank you for taking the time to explain that, because I hadn't spoken to someone about it in that much detail before. And it's rather than just, there's a lot of sort of hate on Twitter at the moment, rather than judging people, taking time to understand them and talk to them.
There's so much polarization in everything, like politics, like environmental movement. Like it always seems to be like a them and an us narrative, and we're never going to get anywhere with that sort of thing.
And the veganism debate, I guess, just continues that, because if you've chosen to be vegan, and animal welfare is such a massive challenge and a massive issue, and it has huge environmental effects. But the anger behind it, I believe, is furthering the polarization and making people who still eat meat never want to not eat meat, because they don't want to be characterized by the character of the stereotype of a vegan.
It's difficult because it's right for people to be angry at the same time.
It is.
Like when you know all of this stuff, like you have a right to be angry.
And that anger is important for kind of making you realize the injustice and making you act. But something Ruby and I are very interested in is looking at what's sustaining our action. So whilst it might be like anger or sadness or grief or like love that ignites you to action, we can't sustain us. We sustain ourselves on love, but I don't think on anger or
That was also quite a nice thing I think about EcoResolution. It appreciates that everyone's on their own path and they're at different stages in their sort of environmental journey. And I think is when you get to a certain point, you can feel like everyone should know this and we should all be doing this. And to an extent, we do all need to change our lifestyles in small ways and major ways. But everyone is on their own journey and we can't all get there straight away. We have to talk to all people from different audiences to kind of help them on their journey. Yeah,
like everyone's on their own journey, but we're all doing it together. So it's like bringing the individual to the collective and then how that relates to then like the big picture system. Yeah. But anyway, I kind of want to go back to fish.
Yes.
Just really quickly. We've spoken about salmon, but I feel like when we go in the menu, I know like global fish are particularly seen on the menu, like sea bass, sea bream, and these are, and sea bass, sea bream, and then like prawns, probably the three biggest ones. And Compassion did some work, and tuna. Yeah, no, we ran an investigation into sea bass and sea bream farms in Greece, and I mean, it was just
really hard to watch. I don't know if you've seen it, but I definitely recommend watching it.
Okay.
And one of the main issues around those types of farms, whereas with salmon farms, for example, in Scotland, there is more humane slaughter methods. The fish that are reared in these farms were just thrown onto ice slurry for when they're like eventually fished to go to market. And these ice buckets are just water and ice, and the fish will be flapping around for about an hour before, up to an hour or sometimes longer before they actually die. So a lot of people imagine that fish, it comes out of the water and it just dies in seconds. But that's why we do need to rethink the way that we view fish, because they don't, they do take a long time to die in those environments, and it's terrifying for them. And sometimes they're even packaged up while still alive.
No.
So it's just, there's so many different ways that the system is just flawed and needs to be improved upon.
Yeah. I wonder if you eat terrified things, if you
take on the trauma.
Somehow that fear and trauma goes into how you take on proteins in their body. I wonder.
With different types of animals, I'm sure I've heard that with pigs, it can change the quality of the meat. So there must be hormones and things in the meat from a scared animal that impacts it for sure, that you'd be ingesting.
The world does seem quite scared.
I wonder if the crisis that we're experiencing is directly related to the fear that all these animals being brought up in and dying in, and then we're then eating.
Is there anything else that Rethink Fish is currently working on?
So some of the different ways that we're trying to make a difference for fish is on either national or international levels. So we've been doing some work in the European Parliament, for example. We held an exhibition there in November, and we had over 9 MEPs talking, so members of European Parliament talking there, and a lot more coming to show their support. And usually you're lucky to even have 2 to 3 MEPs show up. And it's just, the conversation has completely shifted since the beginning of the campaign, from if you raise the issue of fish welfare or fish, people would kind of laugh, but now that is taken much more seriously, and they're focusing in on details about, more human ways of slaughtering the animals, for example. So that's one thing we're doing. We also do sort of national lobbying. In the Czech Republic and Poland, a common tradition out there for the past 50 years or so has been to buy live carp from supermarkets. So that's a live fish. And then you take it home in a plastic bag, keep it in the bath for a few days, and you kill it for Christmas dinner. And one of our big campaigns is to say that you shouldn't be able to buy a live animal to kill it yourself at home. It's a huge amount of stress and trauma for the animal and pain. They should be killed in slaughterhouses. So that's another area that we're trying to tackle, sort of more national legislation. What else do we do? Oh yeah, we'll be launching a campaign in May that will be specifically looking at certification schemes such as MSC, ASC, Friends of the Sea, and how they can implement better welfare standards or introduce them if they don't have any, because at the moment it's just inadequate what they allow to happen under these schemes. And we want to make it easier for members of the public to pick up a package, sort of see these labels and think, oh, that surely means the fish had a good life.
Just to clarify, generally speaking, the aim is either to stop eating fish or to reduce the amount of fish.
Reduce is our message. It's very difficult with fish when it comes from either sustainability or a welfare perspective to be able to buy better. So for the time being, eating less will have the best impact, and finding
avoiding
alternatives.
salmon farms.
Completely avoiding salmon. Yeah, we do not advocate eating salmon from Scotland
And avoiding sea bass.
What are the fish to just never look at again?
Truthfully, if you're buying farmed fish, they lived a terrible life.
So
if you're buying
fish.
wild caught fish, they would have died in a horrific way. So it's very difficult to recommend a better version at the moment. Some farmed fish, as I said, carp and tilapia do live a better life, and are killed and could be killed in more humane ways and aren't fed to fish, but they're just so hard to come by, and you'd need to make sure the farm was a high standard one. So it's very difficult for the time being. So we do recommend eating less fish.
Amazing. Thank you. I would love to hear what your favourite fact about fish are.
A nice one. So one I really like is in the ocean, about 2/3 of life is unexplored. So there's all sorts of animals out there that we don't know what they're like. And we are searching the universe for different types of life, but we don't actually know what we have on our own planet. So by trawling these oceans, we could be getting rid of incredible animals that we don't even know what is there. So we have a duty to protect that and look after it.
Totally. So supporting your work.
Absolutely.
And do you do work with marine protected areas as well?
Not at the moment. We would support marine, like protecting areas, but at the moment we do predominantly focus on intensive farms, factory farming, getting rid of that.
Yeah, so supporting your work, getting in the water, connecting to the ocean.
Yeah.
And reducing eating fish.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thank you guys so much.
Cool.
Cool.
Thank you, James.
Happy?